Welcome to Soil Sessions, a webinar series by the Soil Health Partnership. At this time, I would like to introduce our host, Maria Bowman, to start this soil session. She will be joined by Jack Corneal, Field Director for the Soil Health Partnership.
Thanks, Stacy, and thanks to everyone who's joining us remotely today. We're really excited to talk with you all about our soil sampling processes and protocols and some of the results that we're seeing and all the work that we're doing at the Soil Health Partnership. So before we get started, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we're going to cover on today's webinar. I'm going to start with a brief overview of the Soil Health Partnership for those of you who aren't familiar with our work. And then we're going to get into a little bit why we soil sample, both from a science perspective and from a farm management perspective, and move on to talking about soil health and some of the soil health indicators that we're measuring at the Soil Health Partnership. Then we'll spend quite a bit of time trying to introduce you to how we conduct soil sampling at Soil Health Partnership, all of the parties and players that are involved in that process, and then how those soil sample results get delivered back to the farmer and the further analysis that we do with them. So thanks again for joining, and we hope you enjoy. The mission at the Soil Health Partnership is that we partner with farmers as they're trying new soil health management practices. So some of the practices that the farmers we work with are working with are, for example, a change in a tillage practice. They might be looking to reduce tillage or to move toward a no-till system. They might be incorporating cover crops into their soil health management system, or even looking to switch the type of cover crop that they're working with. And as the farmer's doing that, we collect data over the course of time. So for our partner farms, that's 5 years, with the goal of helping them improve both economic and environmental sustainability on their farms. So we're hoping to provide them with information that they can use in their farm management decision-making as part of this research process. We call ourselves a farmer-led soil health initiative, and that's because we partner with farmers, but also because we think it's really important the way we go about the research process. So when a farmer expresses that they're interested in working with us, instead of telling them that we want them to implement a specific practice on their research field, our field manager will go to them and they'll have a conversation with them about what is the practice that they're interested in trying or working with, so that this becomes more of a natural extension of the management questions that they have on their farm. We work across many states and multiple practices. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And we aspire to being data-driven and analytical always. And it's not that we don't think that anecdotal or things that you're seeing on the field are important, but we want to be able to support those with the data that we collect. We're also governed by strong scientific oversight in this process, and Jack will get into this when we talk about the development of soil sampling protocols at Soil Health Partnership. But we have a science advisory committee that includes folks from ARS, from different universities, that helped us develop our soil sampling protocols, and we come to them not only for support with soil sampling, but for all of our scientific work that we do. And they join our farmer advisory committee and our steering committee in providing us feedback on our structure of our program. So here's a map of our network of Soil Health Partnership sites across the country, and you'll see that we've expanded from where we started in the 3 I states to both northward and westward, as well as toward Tennessee into the southeast. And this is a reflection of the diversity and breadth of the different commodities that we're working with. We now have a partnership with the National Wheat Foundation, and we're working with wheat sites in Nebraska, Kansas, and the Dakotas. As our partnerships have diversified, we've had to work on diversifying our research offerings as we move beyond just corn and soybean rotations into more diverse rotations and more commodities. We've had to think outside the box a little bit. We've also heard from farmers that they're interested in trying to incorporate grazing into their soil health management systems. So that's something that you'll hear more from us about this year and next year, is how we're diversifying our research offerings to meet the management goals that the farmers we work with have. We'll also get into what some of the differences are between our partner and associate sites as we go through the webinar. But our full partner sites commit to working with us over a 5-year period, and they commit to a pretty involved strip trial. So it's a big investment on the part of the partner farmers, whereas the associate site model, there's no time commitment associated with that. And the farmer's basically comparing a management practice in a split field setting. So a side-by-side of perhaps something like cover crop or no cover crop. So it's a little bit simplified. There's less soil sampling and less investment. And we initiated that program because we heard from farmers that they were interested in being a part of the soil health partnerships, but maybe weren't willing to commit to the intensity of research that we had going on with the partner sites. And in order to support this breadth and geography, we have a very important field team of right now 8 members. Each field team member works with about 15 farmers within their geography, and it's really important that we have that support to work with the farmers throughout the research process. So that's critical. And the field team works with the farmers throughout the year. And this graphic shows some of the ways in which we're involved at different stages. Starting at the upper left-hand side of this wheel diagram, you can see that when a new farmer signs up with the Soil Health Partnership, the field manager will start by going out to them and having a conversation with them about what their goals are and working with our program, what types of practices or combinations of practices they're interested in trying potentially on their research field, and then they'll work with them to set up the research plot and research design so it works for their management questions. In the spring at SHP, we're focused on soil sampling, and we'll talk more about this later, but we soil sample before planting. We try and get in when that soil is workable but not too wet in the spring before planting. We'll talk about who's doing the soil sampling later, but those soil samples will go off to the lab at the same time as the farmer is sending information about planting to their field manager and sharing with them the activities on the field. During the summer, we start to get the results back from the soil testing. We'll be collecting aerial imagery on the research field and disseminating that back to the farmers. And in the fall, we're focused on collecting economic and management information as well as yield data so that we can put all of these pieces together for data analysis and reporting purposes. To summarize some of the big buckets in which we collect data, we put them into 5 buckets, but you could separate them out further. The first data type I'll talk a little bit about are agronomic data, and basically these are high-level farm and trial management pieces that incorporate what type of tillage the farmer's using on the research field, what their cover crop types and seeding practices, planting dates, other types of cover crop management. Same thing for their cash crop, whether they use manure, what type of tiling they have on the research field, those types of things. On the management side, we're getting into detailed farm management practices like pesticide and fertilizer input use, the type of equipment used, planting and harvest dates, those types of detailed management variables. And a lot of our data are geospatially referenced, but in particular, we're making sure that we're mapping out the research field and strip boundaries within the field. The soil sampling points, we'll get into this too, where all of the soil samples are taken, and our yield and some of the as-applied maps are also geospatially referenced. At the bottom, we have the soil health and soil nutrient data broken out. We could really think of these together in one bucket because soil nutrients are really part of soil health. But from a soil health perspective, the things that we're collecting that are more soil health specific are indicators. We're testing for indicators from the Cornell Comprehensive Assessment of Soil Health. We're also conducting the Haney test, or the soil health nutrient tool, on our samples. Those are conducted at the strip level. And every year we test for basic nutrient analysis or soil nutrients, and those include pH, macronutrients, NPK, micronutrients, etc. So let's get into why we soil sample a little bit. And I'm going to talk about it from a science perspective, and then I'll hand it over to Jack to talk a little bit about it from a farm management perspective. So from a science perspective, I think about this as we soil sample because we want to understand a couple of things. First of all, we want to know whether the soil sample data or the indicators that we test for support what a farmer is seeing in the field. So we know that a farmer can go out and observe things about their field, and they know whether their soil health is improving in a lot of ways just based upon the things they can see in the field. But we want to confirm that with measurements. So that's one reason why we soil sample. We also, because we're doing these strip trials or a side-by-side trial, we want to see whether the changes in management that are happening on the field are reflected in changes in the soil. So can we see differences in the soil samples between the strips where soil health management practice is being used, like no-till or a cover crop, compared to a business as usual or whatever the farmer's default management was on the other strips? And over time, can we compare those differences in soil health indicators? Can we measure and account for these over time? So those are the primary things that I think about from a science side. I'm going to hand it over to Jack to talk a little bit about what he thinks about from a farm management perspective, why we soil sample.
Yes, when I think about soil sampling from a farm management perspective, I think about maximizing yields and increasing productivity. Knowing your essential elements is key to looking at some of what's going on in your fields. Essentially, you have 15 essential elements that are important to increasing your yields. Those plants need those 15 essential elements, so it's a good idea to know what you have in your fields. If you're lacking any of those essential elements, it will decrease your yields. And knowing what those essential elements are, you can also have a better nutrient application. Another aspect of soil sampling is also knowing your pH ranges. Knowing what your pH ranges are will help you understand what your plant ability to uptake those essential nutrients are. These are some of the examples of why it's important to understand your soil. On the next slide, you'll see here we have the soil testing on SHP partner sites. And the partner sites, we're looking at a basic nutrient analysis conducted annually. We're looking at a 1 acre grid, looking at 2 different depths, looking at a stratification of the soil. The next aspect that we're looking at is every other year we do a soil health test, where we're actually looking at the strip level, we're looking at a Cornell soil health analysis and the soil health nutrient tool, or the Haney test. And new for 2019, we'll be mapping some of those basic micronutrients at the 0 to 2 and the 2 to 6 inch depths that we do our testing at. At the associate sites, you'll see we will do 1 soil sample on the split field. So like Maria was talking about, where we look at those 2 different management options. So we're not doing in-depth soils analysis, but we're really getting at the heart of looking at how those management practices affect yields and productivity, but we also do take into account the soil information. And those are usually taken from the 0 to 6 inch depths. And we still collect key soil health indicators such as soil organic matter, active carbon, aggregate stability, and available water holding capacity. So it's important to note that we are a long-term research project. So you can kind of see in year 1 when we get on the farm and we soil sample, we'll just get the basic baseline soil sampling, which helps the grower understand, okay, where am I at in comparison to other farmers within the network, right? So it gives you an idea of, do I have a healthier soil? Do I have a poor soils? So you might be thinking you're doing the right things, but maybe you're still behind the 8 ball from previous management history. So this gives an idea of where you're at on the spectrum. In year 2, we just do a basic nutrient analysis. And then year 3, we actually get our first soil health comparison. So looking at those aggregate stability, water holding capacity, all those different soil health indicators. But really, we're only looking at probably 2 years of treatment. And so you're probably not really going to get a lot of changes in your soil in that amount of time. Now, if we look at down the road, when you're looking at year 5, you actually will probably have 4 years of treatment. And so this is the time when most people academically and on the farm management side think that eventually you'll start seeing those changes in those soils. You'll see that there's kind of 3 different buckets of soil health and some of the basic nutrient testing that we're doing. So on the chemical side, which is those are 15 essential elements that we're looking at, micronutrients and the macronutrients. Those are key towards, it's something a plant can't get anywhere else but the soil. It's important to note what those are. So that's on the chemical side. And then once again, the pH is important for knowing what your nutrient uptake is. If your pH ranges are off balance, your plants will not be able to uptake the nutrients as effectively. And then the other aspect of soils is the physical, looking at available water capacity, so the ability for the soil to be a sponge. You're also looking at aggregate stability, which is looking at kind of the erodibility of the soil, how well the soil can hold together, and soil texture. Soil texture is a physical property when you're thinking about sand, silt, or clay, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. And then the other aspect is the biological, looking at the soil organic matter, which has a well-established relationship with high productivity soils as long as they're managed correctly. Management being the key. And then there's some aspects of soil organic matter, such as active carbon, soil respiration, and the asoil protein, which Maria will talk about later. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about the soil texture class. Soil texture class is inherent. Pretty much whatever soil texture class you have on your farm, it's not going to change unless there's a major geological event, such as a glacier moving across your fields or some sort of long sustained flood that deposits a lot of silt. So it's important to know what this is. And how, soil texture class affects your farm and why you should sample for it is because, it can change on some of the effects of how you manage your pH ranges. So if you have a heavy clay, you're going to have to manage your lime differently. And how do you adjust the pH? It's important to know for nutrient leaching, right? Are your soils more susceptible to nutrient leaching? Also, erodibility. Knowing, the different soil texture class. I mean, everybody knows, sandy soils erode faster than clay heavy soils. So knowing that is very important. So I have a piece of ground and it's sandy versus a heavy clay soil. I'm going to have to manage it differently. There's different control measures I need to put in place. Do I need to put in waterways? Do I need to have better ditches? Do I need grass terraces around my ditches? So there's different things that you need to look at that way. And also workability, looking at a farm management thing, so which is my early fields to get into, which are my late fields, which ones are going to stay wet, which ones are going to dry out the quickest. That way I can plan my management strategy for my farm effectively. So here you can see a map of our soil texture classes across the program. We have a fairly diverse soil texture class across our network. And so ultimately the goal of our program is really to help give growers the most localized data and management practices for their farm. And so it's important that we do have a range of different soil texture classes so that hopefully we can help different farms across the network and we can use the information that we collect on these different soil texture classes and how they manage those new management practices and how it works on their farm looking at their soil texture class.
Thanks, Jack. So I'm going to talk a little bit about soil health specifically, and we know that managing for soil health is not a new concept, but it does emphasize a more holistic version of the soil ecosystem relative to soil quality or just focusing on soil conservation as we have historically. So NRCS defines soil health as the continued capacity of soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. So again, that has the holistic focus, thinking about not just crop growth, but also the microbiome and humans' sustainability. But it also focuses on this management aspect and how management can impact soil health. So you'll see there from the Cornell Soil Health Manual, soil health also refers to soil properties that change as a result of soil use and management over the human timescale. So Jack talked about how you're probably not going to see a change in a soil textural class unless you have a major geologic event or a flood. Soil health focuses on the pieces of soil that can be changed through management. So that's part of the reason we're measuring these indicators. Even if they're not changing in 1 or 2 years, we might expect that they would respond to management over, for example, 3 or 5 or 10 years. So I'm going to talk about a few specific soil health indicators. I'm not going to talk through all of them, but let's talk about a few of the soil health indicators that we're measuring at SHP and why we think they're important. So we already talked about how organic matter is associated with higher productivity. There are several reasons for this. First, it can contribute to nutrient storage and nutrient cycling, so that supports crop growth. It can also improve water holding capacity, which contributes to resilience to drought and extreme weather events. We know that extreme precipitation or not enough precipitation, those are two of the main things that farmers have to deal with in terms of weather extremes. And so because organic matter has improved water holding capacity, it can help make soil and farms more resilient to those extreme weather events. What is soil organic matter? Well, it's the material in the soil that contains carbon. So it's basically dead plants and animals. And it's measured in the lab using a loss on ignition. So you're heating it up and seeing what happens. And as I said, it contributes to soil structure, nutrient cycling, and water holding capacity. And it has a lot of concrete impacts that you can see as a land manager as well. Aggregate stability is another important one. Again, this is a physical soil property, and it's basically a measure of erodibility. So it's how well the soil sticks together during a rain event, for example. And it's actually measured at the Cornell lab using a rainfall simulator. So you wet the soil and then you subject it to a simulated rain, and then you see what happens. So it makes sense that good aggregate stability would be associated with decreased erodibility. It's also associated with improved water infiltration. Those two things go together, right? And storage capacity. And soil that sticks together holds on to nutrients, right? The water goes in, not off. And this has on and off farm benefits. So on the farm, what we hear from the farmers that we're working with is that improvements in aggregate stability might make it easier to get into the fields earlier, especially if there's a wet spring. Can mean less time spent on managing soil and soil erosion on the field. And improved soil structure and aggregate stability also support crop growth. So less crusting and compaction can mean better crop emergence and also better channels and space for root growth as the crop grows. The third indicator I'm going to talk about is respiration. This is an example of another biological indicator. It's basically a measure of microbial activity in the soil. And one way to, you could look at microbial prevalence directly by measuring microbes or microbial DNA. But this is basically looking for signs of microbial activity, and it's the CO2 released due to that activity in the soil. Why is respiration important? Well, it tends to increase with reduced disturbance and keeping living roots in the soil, but it also is a measure that nutrients are being made available to plants. So it's usually an indicator that there's more nitrate, phosphate, sulfate available to that plant. And it can also impact soil structure and function due to that soil being more biologically active. I'm going to hand it over to Jack now to talk a little bit more about how we measure these soil health indicators at the Soil Health Partnership and what that soil sampling process actually looks like at SHP.
Thanks, Maria. So we have different stages of soil sampling. As you can see here, we essentially looking at the same type of circle where our agronomists, field managers are working with our farmers. If you look at kind of the early spring period, essentially we use that time frame to create soil sampling points and plot design. So figuring out what the management on the farm, what do they want to go after? They want to go after reduced tillage, cover crops. So we help the farmer figure out that. And then what we do is then we create this, the field, identify the field, create soil sampling points, and we ship out all those soil sampling kits to them. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then in the next time frame, we're looking at that spring planting time period. Ideally, we get to the field at pre-plant, which is about 1 or 2 weeks before planting. And if you remember our giant geographic map, this kind of helps. If we kind of stay within that week to 2 week period, that helps us have a uniform sampling timeline across all those different geographies. And it can also be applied across workability of those soils. So not everybody, all the farms are restricted to only sampling during a specific week of the year, right? So we're flexible in adjusting for those geographies and workabilities of the soil. The next timeline is early summer. This is usually when the results are coming back, and we share our results with the growers within 20 to 48 hours. The only way we do the 48 hours if it comes in Friday afternoon. That way we have in our contract that they'll get it by Monday. It's important for us that the data for the farmer is their data. And so we get the data back to them as quickly as possible. And then if we look at the midsummer, it's usually when we get our soil health data back. And we share that with the grower as well. So it does take a little bit longer for data and aggregate. So knowing kind of where they're at on the SHP, within the SHP program, are things changing faster for them? And then that way we can help our field staff disseminate that information, say, hey, this guy's really working on this thing and it seems to be working really well for him. Maybe it's something we should try. So we share a lot of information across our network. And so having this data and analyzing those results are key to our program. And also the growers share that information with each other as well. So where and how do we sample? So here's an example of a field. So Maria was talking about it earlier, but we thought we'd throw it up here. So here's an SHP field. This is kind of a typical field for us. You're looking at 8 strips. Typically those strips will be divided into 4 of them will be for control, or what the farmer normally does. And then 4 of them will be the applied management strategy. So, a reduced tillage, adding cover crops, different things like that nature. Usually a field's about 20 to 80 acres. And one strip is about the equivalent of 4 combine widths wide. And then as you can see, within the strip, you'll see soil sampling points. Now these soil sampling points are a 1 acre grid within the strip. And so typically this example shows that there's 4 1 acre grids within the 1 strip. And so at each one of these points, whoever's taking the soil sample will go to that GPS point, do a radial sample. So walking around that GPS point, collecting soil, and they'll be taking, at each point, they will be taking for the 0 to 2 to 2 to 6 inch depth, they'll be doing a routine analysis or looking at those chemical properties, looking for those essential macro, micronutrients that are essential for plant growth. Those points are also where we're collecting. We actually will collect soil sample and put it into a bucket. And that eventually, as you go along the strip and collecting along, so if you're following along strip 1, you kind of collect soil at point 1, 2, 3, and 4 along that strip, and you're putting that soil into a bucket. And then at the end of the strip, you essentially kind of mix that soil together, and that goes together to create your soil health soil. And usually we take that bucket, mix it up, and then put it into 2 half-gallon bags. So one will go off to the Cornell soil health analysis, and then the other one will go for the Haney test, or the soil health nutrient test. So to give you an example of what it takes to actually sample a field of this size, we usually we tell agronomists and who's ever going to go out there so they know what to expect, is that it takes a whole day to essentially go to the field, sample for the routine analysis, sample for the soil health test. And then we also say, with the add-on that, our suggestion is that you drive directly to the Postal Service where you're going to ship it directly to the lab. So we don't have any issues with the soil getting lost, or it falls out, or somebody puts it in the refrigerator and forgets about it. So essentially taking it directly to some sort of postal service to get it mailed off to the labs immediately. One of the things is that, the Soil Health Partnership is definitely not just the Soil Health Partnership doing this. We rely on a team of field managers to help coordinate our soil sampling efforts that tap into a huge network of farmers, agronomists, soil samplers to get the job done. It's definitely a team effort. There's a lot of coordination that's involved, a lot of man hours, and I just wanted to recognize that. So another component of soil sampling is that we also work with the national staff. The national staff does a lot of the back end work. So you'll see here giant pictures of all of the boxes that we got in, or all of our coolers or Ziploc bags. They're key to helping us with our soil sampling efforts and expand across all geographies. This is kind of a huge deal for kind of a smaller nonprofit to take on such a massive soil sampling campaign. So the back end includes getting all the supplies that all the soil samplers that field managers have coordinated. So everything from Ziploc bags, soil sampling bags, coolers, spatial files, ice bags, all these different things, pretty much everything but a soil probe and a GPS unit. So we hope to make that the experience for the soil sampler as easy as possible and as streamlined as possible. We also include all the shipping labels. So, when you receive a soil sampling box from us, it has everything. So you don't even have to go and pay for the shipping label. So if I think about timeline-wise, on the back end, obviously we have all the front-end stuff of coordinating with the soil sampler and the farmer. But if we think about just putting together a box for a farm, it takes about 30 minutes to pack one soil sampling kit together for a farmer. But that also has multitude of back-end hours of getting spatial files together, coordinating of the shipping materials, training soil samplers, and many other items associated with it. So just to kind of give you a perspective into the world of creating this kind of soil sampling program, it's quite massive.
Thanks, Jack. So Jack just did a great job highlighting the key roles of all of the people involved in this process, super involved, and it involves the agronomists, the soil samplers, the field managers, the national staff. But another key partner that I wanted to make sure that we highlighted in this talk are our laboratory partners. And at the Soil Health Partnership, we work with 2 labs. We already talked about both of them a little bit. We send our soil health testing to the Cornell lab for the comprehensive assessment of soil health, and they run all of those soil health tests for our partner sites. And we also work with Ward Laboratories in Kearney, Nebraska, and they do our basic nutrient testing as well as the Haney test. And for our associate sites, Ward is doing some simple soil health indicators for the associate sites, and we're doing some duplicate testing of some of those indicators at Cornell during our pilot. So we rely on good communication with our labs to get the results back to farmers in a timely fashion. Also, there are inevitably issues that arise, especially when you get into a year like this one where stuff hasn't been happening on the same timeline as it has in previous years. It's been busy at the labs right now. Farmers have been having trouble getting into the fields for planting, which has been really hard for them for a number of reasons, but it's also presented challenges for soil sampling. So we really appreciate our laboratory partners and their continued work with us in this important process. What do we do with all of this information when it comes back from the lab? Well, Jack mentioned that We make sure we get it to farmers right away because these are data that belong to farmers. But we also try and do some secondary analysis and presentation of results with an eye toward how we can make the information more usable and accessible, actionable. So this is the first year that we are mapping results of basic nutrient analysis, and this is to help us and the farmer visualize how these basic nutrients look across their research field. And there are a number of reasons we're doing this. One is because it can contribute to helping the farmer do precision management on that field. It's also a way to look at the prevalence of nutrients at different depths and to see whether those are uniform. Because some of the types of management that we're working with can cause changes in nutrient stratification. For example, in no-till systems, you might see nutrients concentrate toward the top or stratify. And it's good to understand whether this is happening more or less with different types of management and whether that's changing over time. So that's something that we're working with this year, and we hope that it'll be a really valuable way to present the information for our farmers in addition to the soil test results that they get back directly from the lab. So for farms that have been with Soil Health Partnership for a number of years, we are also starting to be able to compare changes in soil health indicators across strips and between treatment and control strips, as Jack mentioned. So in the third year, ideally, we're getting that second soil health sample, and we'll have a third sample in the fifth year. And this helps us look at those changes over time. And this year, we're working on some new ways of presenting this information in farmer reports that we're preparing right now for our summer research meeting. So here's an example of how you might be able to visualize changes in soil organic matter on the left across the strips. So you can see that they're labeled as treatment and control strips, and you can see that the value of the bar is the change between the first and the second sample. And then on the right, I've grouped the control and the treatment strips together. And you can see that this particular example farm had a soil health sample taken in 2015 and then in 2017. And we think that this is also really important. You know, it's great to give a farmer results, but we need to be able to show them how the change in management is impacting those soil health indicators. We also want to be able to aggregate these results across the SHP farm network to see if there are changes in management that are having an impact more broadly. So for example, the farms that have tested for soil health at least twice, we're seeing increases in soil organic matter between 1/3 to 0.5% over the first several years in our program. And I would say that this supports what we already know, and that's that a lot of the farmers that we work with are really exceptional land managers. They're using management to improve soil health over time on their farms, and that's what we're seeing in some of the aggregated results that we're putting together. To close, I want to make a couple of points. I think it's really important to remember that at SHP and more generally, we're still learning about how soil health indicators respond to management. We don't have all the answers here, and I think it's really important that we think carefully about how to take the work that we're doing and apply it to be able to make sound recommendations to help farmers manage for soil health. We realize that it's critical that we collect these data so that we can contribute to filling this gap for actionable information that farmers can use to make management decisions. And I think that's where we see ourselves in this space is taking the information that we're gathering, as Jack mentioned, being able to make some specific recommendations, but also to look at how management relates to soil health over time. And we appreciate you joining today. We appreciate your support for the Soil Health Partnership as we go about this work, and we hope that you learned something about how we go about soil sampling at SHP. Thanks.